At first glance, David Huggins seems like an ordinary guy. A man in his 70s, David works part-time at a deli in Hoboken, New Jersey, and in his spare time, he enjoys writing, painting, and watching science fiction movies. His friends describe him as kind and humble, a little quiet but friendly. But if David were to invite you inside his apartment, you'd notice that he's definitely not an ordinary guy. You'd notice some journals and art supplies scattered here and there. He'd show you his massive sci-fi horror VHS collection, of course, and perhaps he'd have you present a question for his I Ching divination tiles to answer. But up against the wall, you may notice some of his original paintings. And the paintings throw you off a bit because the subject matter is so strange. Because David has canvas after canvas of paintings depicting his naked self alongside alien beings. Alongside a large praying mantis alien, the typical grays, a short hairy creature with glowing eyes, and a tall humanoid man. And in so many of the paintings, there's also a tall alien woman. She has the body of a curvaceous human woman and the head more like that of a gray alien. David tells you that her name is Crescent and that these paintings are based on his very real experiences with beings from another world. Yes, even the paintings that are a little more X-rated, if you know what I mean. In fact, he tells you that he even lost his virginity to this Crescent woman. No, he's not painting from his imagination, but from memory. And as crazy as it sounds, David talks about it so matter-of-factly and with such sincerity that you can't help but believe him. Instead of laughing it off, you feel intrigued. For over 2 decades, David Huggins has produced thousands of paintings depicting over 100 encounters with otherworldly entities, and this real-life paranormal romance saga will be the subject of today's show. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the PCC podcast. My name is Riley, and today we're getting a little frisky because we're talking about the many sexual encounters of David Huggins. Sexual encounters of the alien variety, that is. And you know, David Huggins is not the only person to have experienced something sexual during an abduction experience. For whatever reason, the abduction phenomenon, whatever it may be, does seem to have a sexual component to it. So I'm going to ask that you guys keep an open mind with this one. Because David comes across as a super nice guy, and he's well-liked and genuinely believed by so many of his peers. He also talks about his experiences so matter-of-factly that you kind of want to believe him. Or maybe we all secretly want to bang an alien, who knows? But have I mentioned yet that this is one of the very few abduction cases where there is no hypnotic regression? Finally, you guys don't have to hear me complain about hypnotic regression in an abduction episode. And I may make a couple jokes here and there, but I want to make it clear that in no way am I trying to make fun of Mr. Huggins. I think that he is telling the truth. In some way or another, there is truth to the story. This is David's truth. But before I share this story, please, pretty please, hit that like, follow, or subscribe button if you're enjoying this podcast. And, help spread the word. Tell a friend or family member who also enjoys the paranormal and the unexplained. Truly, word of mouth has been surprisingly effective so far, so thank you. So who is this David Huggins guy, the man behind the infamous alien paintings? Nowadays, David is a part-time deli employee who enjoys writing and painting about his abduction experiences. To him, these paintings, as well as his writings, have been very therapeutic, and he claims that such activities help him remember all that has happened to him. As mentioned, he's a big sci-fi horror nut and has thousands of VHS tapes proudly displayed in his apartment. From the original The Thing, Gordon Douglas's Them, An Invasion of the Body Snatchers, to Forbidden Planet and beyond, David has a massive and very impressive collection. He is divorced but still lives with his ex-wife, Janice. He has a son in his 30s, and his son, Michael, is very supportive of his father. He says that his childhood didn't feel any different, that he believes his dad is telling the truth, and it really didn't affect his life or view of his father growing up at all. And it doesn't affect his relationship with his father now. And in the documentary Love and Saucers, which was the main research source for this episode, they do seem very close. His neighbors and deli customers adore him, and even his boss is a huge fan and believes David's stories. But growing up on a farm in rural Georgia during the 1940s and 50s was not as kind to the artistic and creative young boy that was David Huggins. Probably like many of us alien weirdos, David always felt that he was much different from his family. He was one of 3 children, but his mom and dad weren't the best parents, to say the least. They both liked to drink heavily. His dad would cheat on his mom all the time, and when David started speaking up about his encounters with otherworldly beings, dare he say aliens, his dad would whip him with a belt or with a switch. The household was just a volatile environment overall. He also had some family members who would drag him to tent revivals all the time. You know, the kind of services out in the middle of some dirt field where some preacher claims he can heal the sick, make the blind see, cast out demons, speak in tongues, and all that mumbo-jumbo. And David recalls that this really turned him off from religion early on. And besides, soon enough, David would start seeing miraculous things with his very own eyes. Even though he wasn't a fan of his familial circumstances, David enjoyed farm work and looking for arrowheads on his family's property. In fact, it was during one of his arrowhead hunts that David had his first encounter with a non-human creature. The year was 1951, and David was about 8 years old. He was in a field playing, searching for arrowheads, when he heard a voice that said, "David, behind you." David looked behind him and locked eyes with a small, hairy creature with yellow glowing eyes. The creature was about 3 to 4 feet tall and covered in reddish-brown hair, but it was the eyes that were so, alien. They were perfectly round, like headlights, and for a moment, David says he felt like he could see himself through the eyes of the creature. Terrified, David turned around and ran like hell towards the barn. When he reached the barn, he looked back and saw the, quote, little hairy guy, as David calls him, walking into the woods. And that night, David dreamt of a large, terrifying owl outside his bedroom window, an owl that had those same round yellow eyes. And I'd like to add my little 2 cents here on this first encounter. So when I first started researching this case, it wasn't surprising to me that David saw a small hairy creature as opposed to the typical gray alien. Especially in stories coming from the 50s and 60s, it was perhaps much more common for alleged abductees to report beings like the one David saw. They were often described as hairy dwarfs of some kind. For example, in 1965, in Carazinho, Brazil, a man reported being abducted by 5 hairy dwarfs. Again in Brazil in 1969, and perhaps more famously, Antonio da Silva claimed he was abducted by about 15 small hairy beings. 1954 in France, a miner by the name of Starovsky saw what he described as a small, husky, hairy creature appear and disappear out of thin air. Unlike David's creature, this little hairy guy had slanted eyes, and Starovsky noted that he had a flat nose. And all around the world, our folklore, whether from Central America, Europe, Africa, Australia, wherever, consists of so many stories of small, hairy, and often mischievous beings, like the Accals in ancient Latin America, for instance, or the Duende. I have an whole episode on the Duende. Now, the gray alien motif did become more widespread after the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, and of course now it is the main image that pops into our head when we hear the word alien. And speaking of Betty and Barney Hill, when David said that for a second it felt like he was in the being's head or that he was seeing himself from the eyes of the being, it reminded me of Barney Hill. During his hypnotic regression, Barney said that it felt like their eyes were in his eyes, or its eyes were in his eyes. I don't know, just, some random thoughts I had when I heard about this first encounter. But in 1952, young David had an even more unsettling encounter. He says he was playing in a field when he saw about 8 or 9 little gray men in blue jumpsuits floating down from the sky. The blue jumpsuits are again remarkably common when people report seeing the grays. David was absolutely terrified and immediately started running back home. However, they were there to meet him. David's house was raised up on pillars about 2 feet off the ground, and between the house and the ground, he could see their legs. They were wearing the blue jumpsuits that he could see and black boots, and that's pretty much exactly the same way Betty and Dreesen described them as well. He just squatted beneath the house staring at their legs, petrified, until they all just walked off and disappeared. That same night, David was awoken by a bright light outside his window. He saw those same beings floating down from the ship, a ship which he described as oval and bright white. And before he knew it, one of the gray beings walked through his door and into his bedroom. And they then floated outside his bedroom window together and into the spaceship, naturally. He described the ship as feeling and looking like a doctor's office. Inside, he saw the small hairy creature with the yellow eyes. He saw several of the gray aliens, and taller than all the other grays was this woman, Crescent. She had long black hair like a human's, and she had a human body, but her face and especially her eyes were that of a gray's. David was placed on the infamous examination table, and they started with the medical examinations as aliens are wont to do. And like so many other cases, David says she stuck a metal rod up his nose and broke through some kind of membrane. He says that he felt a crunch when she did this, and it was like they implanted something. In the documentary Love and Saucers, David relates it to how we tag whales and other wildlife, and perhaps it is like that. Perhaps some non-human intelligence from another world is coming into our world and tagging us like cattle or whales. I don't know. That's one of many theories about who these beings are and where they come from. But like so many other abductees, David says that this was quite painful, and he cried out, "You're hurting me." And with that, she just gazed into David's eyes, and this had some kind of hypnotic effect on him, and the pain went away. This is very similar to what Betty Andreessen had to say. And you can easily argue, well, let's see, David came out with his stories between the late 80s and early 2000s. He could have ripped off Betty's story and added in elements from other abduction accounts as well, including some of his own imagination. Sure, but as we will come to find out in later episodes, David and Betty are certainly not the only ones, and we have to remember too that information wasn't as easily disseminated as it is today. It's not like anybody could just access details of an abduction story, say in France or even in different parts of the United States so easily. But anyway, I digress. Also, the way the inside of the alleged UFOs are described by abductees is unsettling, and that David is right. It is described much like a doctor's office. Abductees are often brought into a very plain-looking, sterile room where they're made to wait, then they go into another room where they're made to wait. Sometimes they're asked to change into a medical gown of some kind. And then, of course, there's the actual procedure aspect of it. Specifically, the metal rod that is inserted up the nose and the other rod that is inserted in other places. And when I finally start my video series on Jacques Vallée's research, we'll go over some very old, even archaic cases where these beings are seen wielding long metal rods, like long before the advent of science fiction. But anyway, during another encounter in 1952, David was in the barn when he heard a strange noise. He went outside to investigate, and just outside the barn, he saw a giant praying mantis being just staring down at him. Of course, David screamed and started running away, but not before the praying mantis managed to spray him with some kind of blue liquid that he said evaporated rapidly. Again in 1953, David was playing in the barn at a friend's house when he heard a noise that sounded like a cow mooing. He went outside to investigate, and he saw a gray face with large black eyes staring at him from behind some bushes. The next thing he remembers is seeing a bright flash of light and waking up in the middle of a field, but he is not alone. Standing all around David are the grays, and they're just looking down at him. He remembers hearing 3 beeping noises, and then again he is out, and the next thing he knows, he is in the middle of another field with weeds up to his waist. He had no recollection of how he got there, and ultimately had 2 hours of missing time. And anytime David would tell his parents about this, his dad would just say, "Stop making things up, boy," and attack him with his belt. During one of his closer encounters, he told Crescent what happened when he would tell his parents that he saw them. So Crescent just told him, well, don't tell them then. And he stopped telling anybody. Also, it seems as if David's experiences drew him to the sci-fi horror genre he would ultimately become so enthralled with. He says movies with insect-like aliens particularly interested him. And he said something always felt familiar about it. Because just to be clear, so David has an epiphany in 1987 about all these events. He had a clue that he had experienced things, and he knew he was forgetting a large part of his childhood, but something would happen for all of these memories to come flooding back. So as a child, he would have these encounters, and then he'd just kind of forget about them, or they'd feel like a dream to him. It's kind of like that hallmark amnesia that is so common in abduction cases. He said he would remember vague images of beings with black eyes. He thought he remembered levitating from his bed at night. He also remembered being up in space, But the memories were so dreamlike and so fuzzy that he thought that's all they were, dreams. And who knows, maybe at the end of the day, that's all they were. That's up for you to decide, perhaps. But you might be asking yourself, well, when do things start to heat up between David and Crescent? Well, when David was 17, he was just walking in the woods one day, minding his own business, when he saw a fully naked Crescent standing in the woods. So, there she is, bearing all. Again, she's got the body of a woman and the face of an alien, which David is into, I guess. And he was so overcome with sexual desire that he says, quote, "I couldn't get my pants down fast enough." But what's kind of suggested here is that David was given that strong, intense desire for Crescent by Crescent herself. Again, these beings seem to be able to control people's thoughts and physical sensations, which that's the most disturbing part about abduction cases for me because, there's all these stories about how the Greys made these experiencers feel happy and gave the impression that they were friendly, even angelic. But if they are capable of influencing people's minds and emotions and bodily functions, and they are using it to do really weird things to people, they can't be good, in my opinion. But anyway, so David laid down there in the woods and Crescent climbed on top of him and she did her thing. He said when he climaxed, it was so pleasurable that it was almost painful. And that is basically the story of how David lost his virginity to an alien, guys. Not sure how romantic or consensual that is, but David seemed to be okay with it. And especially now that David had sex with an alien woman, he just couldn't stay in Georgia any longer. He wrote a note to his parents basically saying goodbye and, to go F yourselves, and he headed to New York City. He enrolled in art school and he left small town America behind. And while he liked New York City and loved being able to paint and meet new people, he always felt as if something was lacking or something was missing in his life. He moved to New York City during a widespread transportation strike, so he pretty much had to walk everywhere, but during a downpour one night, he took a chance and tried to hail a cab, and it worked. And a female cab driver picked him up, which he thought was a bit strange. Remember, this is the 1960s, not a lot of female cab drivers around, if any really. Odd profession for a woman of this time. It was dark, so he could barely make out her face, but he remembers she had these dark, almost kind of eerie eyes, and that something about them seemed eerily familiar. As he lay in bed that night, he couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, and in his dreams, he saw the face of an alien woman called Crescent. Just her face shrouded in darkness. It's one of his most unsettling paintings, in my opinion. And this was the beginning of a series of clues that eventually brought back all those memories from his childhood and adolescence. He kept dreaming of this alien woman, and the dreams were getting clearer and clearer, and they were, of course, getting more intimate. David says that he was becoming convinced that these were not just dreams, but that something was happening to him at night, and this Crescent woman was real. She was from another world entirely, but their interactions felt way too real. So he decided to buy Crescent some flowers, these beautiful pink clymens. He knew that she would be coming back that night. She and the other beings, which we'll get into a second, had said so, and he wanted it to feel like a date. And throughout the story, David pretty much considers her his girlfriend. So he cleaned up his apartment real nice, lit some candles, and left the flowers for her. And the way he tells it, when he woke up the next morning, they were gone. And he took it to mean that Crescent had taken them, and this kind of proved to him that she was really real. Now, of course, that sounds a little unbelievable, but this is David's story. Also, David's story might be reminding you of another abduction story. I can't think of the name right now, but I do remember the guy who he said that this beautiful alien woman would come visit him at night for, bedtime stuff, and they had actually found a hair no one could explain. It was like a very, very clear, like it's not even blonde, it's like whitish, blondish, clearish hair. And they took a DNA sample, and the hair sample was so bizarre too. Like it had some very ancient Chinese DNA, like some Chinese variant that's like not even seen on Earth anymore or something like that, as well as Basque DNA. Shout out to all my fellow Bascos. So it was human DNA, but it was exceptional human DNA, which leads some people to believe it was indeed an alien-human hybrid that was visiting this abductee. But of course, that's another story for another time. During their meetings, David says that the praying mantis being was always there watching them do the deed, and just always watching in general, no matter what they were doing. And by the way, David also said that one of the ways he and Crescent were most intimate was by rubbing their heads together. And during Love and Saucers, he tells people, that you and your partner should really try it sometime. So I don't know, maybe try it out and tell me if it does anything for you. But anyway, he eventually settled down with his now ex-wife Janice. But in August of 1987, things really started to change for David. He claimed that again, he felt as if something was off. He felt exceptionally paranoid and like someone was in their house all the time. And it's kind of unclear how many of these alien interactions David remembers from the get-go and how many came to him later on. It's also a little unclear if and when he thought these were dreams versus reality. But in August of 1987, he heard a radio broadcast about Bud Hopkins' book Intruders, which is about the alien abduction phenomenon, and memories started to trickle in. He started reading the book on August 17th, 1987, and that's when it all came flooding back to him. He said it was like memory after memory after memory was being re-downloaded into his brain. And it is at this point where he remembers clearly now all the memories from his childhood. He now vividly remembers everything that happened with Crescent, and some of what he remembers is quite unsettling. He remembers that Crescent and the praying mantis, let's just call him Mantis from now on, he remembers that Mantis and Crescent showed him his children that he made not only with Crescent, but with several other alien women. He also has a rather distressing memory. He remembers a time when Crescent brought one of their children to him and said that something was wrong with it, that it wouldn't move, that it was going to die. And he says that Crescent was holding this baby awkwardly and in an unsafe manner. He grabbed the baby from her and showed her, this is how you hold a baby. You cradle them in your arms like this. And he said it was like electricity transferred from him to the child, and the baby was now normal and healthy. At this, Crescent and Mantis showed him all of his other children, and David zapped them back to life, essentially. And let's see what else. At one point, David is shown an alien being in a plastic bag, which creeped him out quite a bit. He didn't really go in depth with that one, but that one especially creeped me out. Alongside the Greys, the mantis, and the small hairy creature, David also regularly encountered a tall, human-looking male who had a knob on the back of his head. And as you can imagine, Mrs. Huggins wasn't too supportive of David and his alien lovers, and she ended up divorcing him. She just, didn't want to hear about the alien stuff anymore, but he did maintain a good relationship with his son, as I mentioned in the beginning. As a form of therapy, as a form of journaling in a way, David started painting these encounters he now knew he had experienced for decades. David never sought fame or attention from this, and it wasn't until 2002 that he met someone who finally convinced him to show the world his paintings. He joined a kind of abductee support group and made friends and found comfort in sharing his experiences with people who wouldn't ridicule him. He slowly but surely started showing some of these new friends his paintings, and a woman named Farah helped him publish a book called Love in an Alien Purgatory in 2009 that showcases a large amount of his paintings. And always when it comes to something like this, people will say, well, obviously he just did it for the money. But okay, number one, it's a really roundabout way to make a few dollars. And number two, that's really all these people make at the end of the day. Over the years, David has easily spent way more money on art supplies than he's ever earned from sharing his story. And number three, David doesn't seem like the kind of guy who is very into money or trying to make lots of it. He lives a very modest, humble lifestyle and is described as quiet. He's friendly, but generally likes to keep to himself. And sure, there are just, people who like to lie just to lie, and people who make up stories because they like the weird attention they get. But David just doesn't seem like that guy. Which leads us to the following questions. If David made this whole thing up, then why? If he's telling the truth, where do these beings come from? Or is this one man's way of coping with trauma, of coping with feeling left out and unhappy, like he doesn't really belong? Because I tell you what, I wrote this episode at my job where at my job, I'm surrounded by 15-year-olds who constantly disrespect me and make me hate my life sometimes. And writing this episode and doing research for this podcast is a nice little escape from those demons. And I'm sorry, but sometimes they do act like demons. It's getting bad out there, y'all. I'm just saying. But I think something out of this world happened to David at some point. I can't speak on how many times it happened or if all the details David provides, the vivid details shown in his paintings, are true, but one aspect of his abductions I want to talk about for a second is the idea of an astral body. David refers to what he calls the, quote, other me, and hints at the fact that during many of these abductions, it is his astral body or spirit body that is taken onto these ships and interacting with these beings. And personally, I kind of like this astral theory, that really people aren't being physically taken, but their astral body is going on these weird journeys into another world, perhaps. But if that's the case, what about people like Travis Walton? His friends saw his physical body get taken by a large, bright craft. So who knows? These abduction stories have a lot of commonalities, but they also have a lot of contradictions and inconsistencies. Also, we know David had a traumatic childhood, at least to some degree. Maybe he dove into these stories, these vivid daydreams, to escape his home life. Like, I am diving into alien lore to escape my job and the fact that I can't afford anything anymore. I also want to talk about the praying mantis alien. There have been others who have reported this entity, including Linda Porter in her abduction story in 1963. Abductees often claim that the praying mantis alien seemed to be kind of like an overseer. David Huggins said that the praying mantis, was always just there watching. But aside from the alien abduction stories, there are tons of legends about praying mantis creatures in mythologies all around the world, along with other insect beings. And people who experiment with DMT, the powerful hallucinogen, claim to see praying mantis entities. We talked about the DMT factor a little bit with the Betty Andreessen case too, that maybe there's something going on with these abductees, something that causes their brains to produce abnormal amounts of DMT. Or perhaps DMT allows one to see into these other worlds. And if that's true, who knows what the praying mantis beings are, where they come from, what they're up to. But let me know what you guys think about that one. It's definitely a theory I'm very much interested in. To me, personally, I think this whole phenomenon has to do with other dimensions and DMT perhaps. Lastly, I heard this theory really recently and it's weirdly terrifying to me. So I guess some science people came up with a theory in order to, quote, debunk the gray alien phenomenon. They suggest that the pale, featureless face and large black eyes mimic how we perceive human faces when we are an infant. That when you look up into your mom's eyes as a newborn, what you see staring back at you would look like a gray alien. So perhaps some people are remembering these featureless, bug-eyed faces from their early infancy. In a way, I'm like, I don't know, that's kind of compelling, kind of makes sense, but that theory doesn't explain the praying mantis aliens or the hairy dwarf-like aliens or the helmeted aliens people have claimed to see as well. It's also not as satisfying, and I guess reality rarely ever is, but you can't tell me that extra-dimensional beings don't exist. That's just me. And they also have a religious studies professor on the documentary Love and Saucers, and he suggests that according to our ancestors, strange, weird, and terrifying-looking beings have been coming to visit us from the sky for millennia. They're called angels or gods and are often terrifying to behold, but in many instances, close encounters with these beings, no matter how terrifying or even painful they may be, are also pleasurable, ecstatically so even, as in the case of David Huggins. The abduction phenomenon may indeed be some kind of spiritual experience after all, getting back to the whole astral body thing. And I know we've already talked quite a bit about who or what these aliens may or may not be or where they might come from, but if you have any thoughts on the matter, please feel free to leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube or message me directly on Instagram. I really hope you guys have enjoyed this odd tale, and is it weird that I find this story kind of like almost endearing? I love the idea of an old man painting his alien stories with no shame at all. He's just so matter-of-fact about it, and it was heartwarming to see how much his neighbors and coworkers and family accepted him. And no matter what you believe, maybe you think David is full of shit. His paintings and his stories hurt no one and perhaps make us want to believe. It adds a little wonder and mystery to the world, and I think this world needs a lot more of that. And with that, I will say take care, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. And next week, we're talking about the black-eyed kids finally. But until then, may you all have a great week and out-of-this-world dreams. Thank you.